Canadian premiers say they want to reduce our reliance on the U.S. After calling for federal support on new oil pipelines this morning, they are taking their concerns directly to the Prime Minister.
I have always felt that tariffs are their own punishment, and I still don't understand why Americans want to punish the consumers.
Well, I'm never confident with President Trump. I'm confident with Prime Minister Carney. I know he's going to do his very best to get a deal, but I don't trust President Trump. He'll say one thing one day and say something else and then in the news the next day. We want a fair and free trade. But if he wants to attack our steel industry, our aluminum industry, other industries, we need to hit them back.
I also look at tariffs as their own punishment. When the American government puts tariffs on Canadian goods, it just hurts the American people, the consumers and the businesses who rely on those products. When we put tariffs on ours, it just hurts our people. So I don't love tariff wars. I don't think that they benefit consumers. They don't benefit businesses. But
President Trump's tariffs, this guy drives me nuts. I just get wound up. You know, he's sitting there, he drives it. Here I go off my speech. My team starts getting nervous when I go off the teleprompter. And by the way,
Alberta and Ontario are joining forces to push for new railways and pipelines. Today, Premiers Danielle Smith and Doug Ford signed 2 memoranda of understanding in Calgary. One of those documents focuses on new pathways for resources, saying they'll work together on the development of rail infrastructure to support the subsequent phases of the Ring of Fire, where Ontario hopes to mine critical minerals, and on joint development of commercial options for building new oil and gas pipelines.
President Trump taking direct aim at our economy. His goal is to take every single business out of our country, out of our province, and bring it down to the U.S. But I'll tell you, I will fight like I've never fought before, and we're going to continue fighting against President Trump and his radical views.
Alberta and Ontario are teaming up to study energy corridors between the 2 provinces. After the premiers flipped some pancakes this morning, they signed deals to reduce trade barriers and promote a pipeline.
it should give us pause that we in Eastern Canada are overly reliant on oil that either has to come by way of the United States or has to be shipped in from overseas. And so we could have addressed that years ago with the Energy East pipeline.
Ontario and Alberta are working together to build new energy and trade infrastructure, including pipelines and rail lines.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith agreed to kickstart a feasibility study that will look at a pipeline going east and a railway going west, carrying oil, gas, and critical minerals, an effort to supercharge each economy.
Oil pipelines, gas pipelines, propane, but also food, fiber, manufactured goods, and critical minerals. That to me is where I think that I would like to go with this MOU.
Alberta and Ontario just signed a surprise deal that could reroute Canada's energy away from its biggest customer, the United States. They're looking at new pipelines and railways that would connect east to west, all within Canada's borders. This isn't just about building infrastructure. It's about reducing reliance on the U.S. and responding to growing trade tensions. Trump's tariffs and border fees are making it harder for Canadians to do business as usual. So what does this shift mean for your gas bill or the investment climate here at home? Stick around as we break down the details and the real impact on everyday Canadians. There's a twist in all this. The very policies designed to put America first are pushing Canada to look elsewhere. For decades, the U.S. has been Canada's biggest trade partner, but now that relationship is under real strain. Take the new $250 visa integrity fee, for example. This isn't just a minor inconvenience. It applies to international travelers, and the U.S. Travel Association says it will boost upfront travel costs by about 144%. Eric Hansen, from the association, called it a giant leap backwards and slammed it as an unnecessary financial barrier. But it doesn't stop there. Trump has hinted at 35% tariffs on certain imports, maybe more from the 1st of August. That's got Canadian businesses and travelers on edge. These aren't just economic moves, they're sending a message. Canadians are starting to feel unwelcome, and that's a big shift from the usual close relationship. The Alberta-Ontario Pipeline and Railway Plan is a direct answer to these signals. It's not only about dodging tariffs, it's about showing Canada won't be boxed in by U.S. trade pressure. The Congressional Budget Office estimates the visa fee could net roughly $29 billion for the U.S. Treasury, But at what cost to cross-border trust and cooperation? The so-called refundable nature of the visa fee adds another layer of confusion. Although labeled refundable, the refund process is undefined, leaving many experts skeptical they'll ever recoup the charge. For Canadians, this is just more bureaucratic hassle on top of what used to be a straightforward relationship. And with many U.S. visas lasting up to a decade, the uncertainty only grows. The U.S. Travel Association points out that these fees will hit business travelers and tourists the hardest, making them think twice before crossing the border. It's not just about the money, it's about the message being sent. All these barriers have Canadian premiers asking, why not build our own routes? That leads us to the Alberta-Ontario plan. The pipeline plan between Alberta and Ontario is more than just another infrastructure project. It's a move that could fundamentally shift how Canada moves its energy. The project is designed to create a direct corridor linking Alberta's oil, gas, and critical minerals with Ontario, and from there, opening new doors to global markets. Instead of the old north-south routes into the U.S., this is about building east-west pathways. The deal also calls for using Ontario steel in pipeline and rail construction, signaling tangible buy-in from both provinces. But the path isn't clear. Past proposals through Quebec face strong public and political resistance, making an eastward route complicated. That's why a route heading northwest through British Columbia is getting attention. A deepwater port on the BC coast could allow Alberta crude to reach Asian markets directly. Prime Minister Mark Carney has hinted the Northwest BC pipeline may make Ottawa's priority projects list, but the hurdles are obvious. The Impact Assessment Act and the oil tanker ban on BC's North Coast are big legal obstacles. Every step forward means more environmental reviews and Indigenous consultations. Alberta's pushing Ottawa to help streamline the process, arguing that national economic security should outweigh bureaucratic delay. There's also the issue of financing. Past projects like Keystone XL needed federal assurances. Here, premiers push for Ottawa to de-risk new routes. Shallow coastal waters at James Bay raise questions about tanker feasibility, so rail-to-ship options may be explored. The feasibility study will look at whether rail could fill gaps where pipelines aren't possible. But it's not clear who will pay for these alternatives, and investors are still wary after the Keystone XL cancellation. The private sector wants guarantees before putting money on the line. This isn't just a Canadian story. If Alberta and Ontario succeed in rerouting even a portion of Alberta's 3.8 million barrels per day away from the U.S., the impact could ripple through American border states. Entire supply chains in places like Michigan and North Dakota depend on Canadian energy. The Memorandum of Understanding is only a first step, just a commitment to study, not to build. But the message is clear. Provinces aren't waiting for Washington or Ottawa to make up their minds. Environmental groups are already gearing up for a fight. The same activists who stalled Trans Mountain say any new pipeline faces similar resistance. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith keeps the focus on jobs and market access, not emissions. She argues that energy workers need these projects, especially with living costs rising. For her, it's about paychecks, not pledges. Behind closed doors, industry leaders talk about unlocking $50 billion in trapped Alberta resources if they can reach Tidewater. But the same problems that killed Energy East, First Nations litigation, environmental targets, regulatory reviews, are still there. Alberta wants Ottawa to push through opposition, even if it means political fallout. The fact that premiers are willing to pick this fight says a lot about how much the U.S.-Canada relationship has changed. If these plans move forward, the effects won't just be felt north of the border. When Canadian provinces talk about bypassing the U.S. with new pipelines and trade routes, the potential fallout for American industries becomes hard to ignore. Border states like Michigan, which depend on just-in-time auto parts moving back and forth, suddenly face the risk of slowdowns and higher costs. Truckers and tourists are now hit with steep visa charges. According to the U.S. Travel Association, the new $250 visa integrity fee increases upfront costs for international visitors by 144%. Jeff Freeman, the association's president, calls the fee foolish, describing it as a self-imposed tariff on one of our nation's largest exports, international travel spending. The travel industry points out that foreign tourists spend around $200 billion a year in the U.S., and new barriers like this could push that money elsewhere. Refineries in states like Washington and Michigan rely heavily on Canadian crude. If even a portion of Alberta's oil is diverted away from the U.S., Supply chains would have to scramble for alternatives, and local economies could take a direct hit. The American Petroleum Institute has said in the past that Canada supplies over 40% of U.S. oil imports. Losing access to that volume, even partially, wouldn't just mean higher prices at the pump. It could mean layoffs in communities built around cross-border energy flows. The domino effect doesn't stop with energy and travel. Farmers on both sides of the border are watching closely. Canadian wheat often heads south for processing before being re-exported, but new rail links to eastern ports could cut American middlemen out of the equation. Ontario manufacturers see a chance to supply pipeline parts and heavy equipment for east-west projects, instead of importing from U.S. steel mills. Meanwhile, American business groups and border governors are starting to push back, warning Washington that these new barriers are hurting local economies and threatening jobs. As these trade flows and border fee standoffs escalate, Canada's provinces see an opening to map their own independent routes. The premiers aren't just reacting to U.S. policy, they're making a statement about where Canada wants to go next. Alberta and Ontario's pipeline agreement is a direct signal to Ottawa and to international partners. Canada is prepared to challenge policies that limit its economic options. The premiers are not just asking for tweaks, they're demanding major changes. The Memorandum of Understanding calls for repealing or amending the Impact Assessment Act, the oil tanker ban, the net zero electricity mandate, and the oil production cap. Premier Danielle Smith has made it clear that these federal rules are, in her view, holding back Alberta's energy sector and costing the province billions. She's warned she might invoke Alberta's Sovereignty Act to sidestep federal rules, underscoring how high the stakes feel. The Impact Assessment Act, in particular, has become a flashpoint. Alberta calls it a source of investment-killing uncertainty, arguing that lengthy reviews and consultations delay or block projects that could open new markets and create jobs. The tanker ban is another major point of friction. By restricting oil shipments from the Pacific coast, Alberta says Ottawa is forcing Canadian crude to sell at a discount to U.S. buyers. The province's leadership sees this as a deliberate move that limits Canada's leverage and keeps it dependent on American refineries. Now, instead of waiting for federal approval, Alberta and Ontario are building their own alliances to sidestep these obstacles. They agreed Alberta fleets will prioritize Ontario-built vehicles, showcasing early interprovincial synergy and a commitment to strengthening Canadian supply chains. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has said this is about building up Canadian supply chains instead of relying on foreign ones. These moves aren't just symbolic, they're practical steps toward reducing reliance on the U.S. and building out east-west trade corridors. Environmental groups are already mobilizing. The same activists who fought Trans Mountain are preparing to challenge any new pipeline proposals, saying these projects run counter to Canada's climate commitments. Alberta, though, is shifting the conversation. Smith and her government focus on jobs, energy security, and the cost of living. They are betting that in an economic climate where inflation is squeezing households, the promise of stable paychecks will outweigh environmental arguments in the eyes of many voters. The push for interprovincial liquor trade is another sign of how priorities are changing. Ontario wants to make it easier for local producers to ship alcohol across provincial borders. For Alberta, this is about creating new markets for its own producers and showing that provinces can work together outside the old federal frameworks. With new rail and pipeline routes potentially bypassing Quebec, Alberta is making it clear that it will find a way to get its resources to market, even if it means leaving traditional partners behind. Federal officials keep insisting that national unity depends on balancing regional interests, but Alberta's approach is confrontational. The threat of using the Sovereignty Act, even as a bargaining chip, shows just how far the province is willing to go. This is not just a provincial spat. It's a message to Washington and to global markets that Canada will not accept trade terms that leave it at a disadvantage. The details will take months or even years to work out, with feasibility studies and legal battles ahead, but the direction is set. You can see how these moves are already changing the tone of cross-border negotiations. The Alberta-Ontario pipeline and railway agreements mark a major shift in Canada's approach to trade and energy. Trade barriers and new U.S. fees pushed Canada to find its own path. Now it's a test of whether interprovincial unity can outpace U.S. influence. Alberta and Ontario's push for energy independence shows how quickly alliances can change when partners feel boxed in. If Canadian crude starts bypassing American refineries, the U.S. stands to lose billions. But this is about more than oil. It's about sovereignty, and control over future trade. Tell us below, do you think Canada's provincial playbooks can outmaneuver Washington's policies? For more straight analysis on politics and your bottom line, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive on how this deal could reshape your energy bills.